Welcome to the Zen Castle. The Buddhist teachings of karma, rebirth, and even the perpetuity of suffering in life are all key doctrines taught by the original Buddha. A problem many skeptics see, however, is that these teachings can be rather scary, particularly if interpreted incorrectly. To some, the doctrines of karma and how it leads to reincarnation can seem to be like an outdated superstition, but to others, they can also strike fear in their hearts. Likewise, the teachings of the first noble truth, suffering or dukkha, as an ongoing element of life, can appear at first to be a very dark idea. Within the Buddhist lessons found on the topic of karma and rebirth, many difficult questions can be raised. For example, if there is no God within Buddhism, who makes the decision regarding whether we reincarnate into royalty or the polar opposite? For example, a disease-infested swamp rat. In like manner, if there is no supreme deity in Buddhism, which is what the first Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama, taught, then who or what decides if you enter enlightenment or nirvana? Many questions and false notions are pondered in modern times regarding Buddhism. Just as in any faith-based system, there are many critical viewpoints, one of which that I will dispel later is how can the Buddha insist that we must live in a state of non-self and without desire or cravings, yet at the same time teach there is an element of our existence that becomes reincarnated or reborn. Did he even teach reincarnation? Or is that a Hindu concept? We could potentially be talking about a personal self that reconfigures into another being, and in a worst case karma scenario, that new self might end up being a bloodthirsty, murderous monster. Another question might be, does karma suggest our lives are predetermined? If so, this would be contrary to the Buddha's teaching of impermanence and, of course, the doctrine of free will. Also, if our destiny is predetermined by karma, can that be changed by ourselves based on us wanting to be a better human creation? And would that be contrary to the Buddha's lessons regarding the removal of wants and desire, which are related to the second noble truth, of course? Needless to say, but I'll say it anyway, some would argue that there is a very scary dark side to Buddhism. I teach that in some variations of Buddhism, there indeed are very troubling doctrines that can be revealed once you truly begin to engulf yourself within them. For example, not in Zen Buddhism, but in other Buddhist schools, there is a multiverse filled with many strange gods and demons. But allow me to add that Christianity, Islam, and even Hindu or Sikh faith systems have their own frightening content, such as Satan, ghosts, demons, and even ethnic cleansings. As another example, some versions of Tibetan Buddhism, such as the Vajrayana and Theravada types or versions, have extremely upsetting elements. But Zen Buddhism, derived from the original version of the Mahayana school, does not. So what is so frightening about these non-Zen versions of Buddhism, and how do they differ from some of the scary doctrines found within Islam, jihad annihilation, for example, or within Christianity, eternal suffering in the lake of fire, for example? Well, to begin, one might say that on paper, most of Buddhism looks pretty good. The problem is that few Westerners understand the vast differences between the 8 to 10 types of Buddhism taught worldwide in Buddhist temples. They therefore take the worst and most distorted teachings by supposed Buddhist teachers as the truth, fueling the fires of criticism. If you had many months or even years to correctly and carefully study all branches of Buddhism, the answer would indeed be yes. Buddhism, if taken from a distorted doctrine, then retaught incorrectly for centuries, can indeed pose several scary concerns in the mind of an eager student. It has been said that Buddhism is somewhat nihilistic, but still many times more realistic than Christianity. As a Zen Buddhist teacher, however, I find absolutely no nihilism, emptiness, or anarchism within the Japanese Mahayana version of Buddhism, namely Zen Buddhism, which is also called the Chan school of Buddhism in China, the Son Buddhism version in Korea, and in Vietnam, it is referred to as Thien or Tien. If you know anything about the Eightfold Path to Nirvana, you will quickly realize the original teachings of the Buddha himself focused on love of all living beings, acting and speaking with kindness and respect, and also a deep care for our fellow man. So, how can that even remotely be called nihilistic? I once heard a very negative story written by an atheist that was teaching a class in a small Buddhist private school, and sadly, it was published on the internet, damning the entire Buddhist faith and written with a very twisted viewpoint. So, please allow me to explain with my own rebuttal. Apparently, it was a discussion of karma and how the concept can be very insidious when it relates to our failures in life, which of course are just part of human existence, whether Buddhist or not. Supposedly, on one occasion, a student of this school was having problems with getting good test scores. This may have been because of laziness, a learning disability, or maybe even a health issue. Saddened by the problem this child was having with the test scores, they were sad because of the result of their test scores, so she or he approached a monk and asked for help. Here's where it gets weird. Whomever this monk was, whether made up or not by this atheist author, whomever they were, they gave the explanation. They described that the poor test scores was related to karma. The supposed reason was because the child was a murderer in a past life and also enjoyed burning books, and therefore is doomed in this life to have a learning disability. Now, let me add to this commentary, because I too am a teacher, that a monk would never say anything like this to a child if they were a true monk, particularly a monk that studied the noble ways or paths of the faith. As an example, I'm putting up a slide now of the Eightfold Path to Nirvana or enlightenment that is a foundational teaching within Zen Buddhism. If this monk were speaking to a student in this manner, causing a child to be distraught about karma, then they would be violating the roads or paths of right intention, right view, and especially right speech. Any true monk should know this wheel of enlightenment like the back of their hand, and they would never teach a young one that they were a murderer in a previous life and therefore must live with bad karma and punishment for the rest of this life. In like manner, when I think back on my youth, I had a very rude older brother who taught something similar. And we were not even Buddhist. He would say that every time I bumped my head or fell down, it was because God was punishing me. So there is a dark side to many religious faiths, and especially to the foolish people that propagate such faith, because it's the tongue that does the most damage rather than the sentences written in a holy book. The interesting point is that Zen Buddhism has no formal scripture that is either sacred or holy. Remember, the Zen school of Buddhism is a way of thinking, a philosophy, and a methodology of living, such as what is taught within the paths of right concentration and right mindfulness. No matter what you've heard, the Zen form of Buddhism is not religion at all. It is a pure mindset. So what this unkind and foolish author published on the internet is an extremely wrong interpretation of karma as related to Buddhism. In essence, they were hateful and they were a critical atheist, which is somewhat abnormal because I've met several atheists with kind hearts. In actuality, they and others are attempting to disseminate falsehoods that relate to a dark side of karma. I would like to say, however, that karma relates much more to this life than any past life. For example, we may reincarnate in this life as someone who is less than whom they were in a previous life. For example, you were rich. Now, in this life, you are middle class. Okay? But that does not mean we cannot turn things around through appropriate mindful thinking and actions. You see, the doctrine of karma is also called the law of sowing and reaping for the Christians, and the law of cause and effect in the scientific or secular community. It is one of the most profound universal realities and cannot be changed or altered. To sum up karma in simple terms, we might say that in this life, our actions determine our outcomes. You receive what you give. So if you give hate and unkind words to others, sarcastic remarks, insults, those bounce back like a boomerang onto your own head. Karma takes cause and effect a step further, however, because it implies that not only will you suffer from bad words or actions in this life, but they are carried forward into the next. Similarly, loving and generous actions, which are key tenets of Buddhism, will also be rediscovered as part of your being in the next life. Other critics of Buddhism will incorrectly claim it is a historical derivation of Hinduism. Nothing can be farther from the truth. They will say that life itself is a painful and ongoing catastrophe that cannot be corrected. Again, if you know anything about the foundational teaching of Buddhism, let's take the third and fourth noble truths as an example. You will see that suffering caused by cravings and desires does not have to be a lifelong event. The third noble truth is the doctrine of nirvana, as you may know, which is the reversals of the first two negative noble truths. And the fourth noble truth is like the first in that it points us to the eightfold path to enlightenment and how we can think and live in order to enter nirvana, which is a state of peace, tranquility, and happiness in the present day life, not, like some believe, a drifting off into an eternal sanctuary of a Christian-style heaven. Said in a slightly different way, the perpetual cycle of karma and reincarnation does not have to be dark or ruthless, as some may teach. In no way does karma teach that we are born as an innocent child and then are forced to repeat life after life in horrible ways until we finally get it right someday, and will therefore earn a chance to be reborn in a magnificent way. Always remember the third noble truth when you listen to critical, scary teachings about Buddhism. As Zen Buddhists, we teach our students that with the right persistence, the right mindset and determination, all the suffering of this life can be extinguished through the removal of selfish desires and wants. The Sanskrit word for extinguished is mystically translated into English as nirvana'd. Another supposedly scary teaching, which I'd like to say is also false, is that having joy, laughter, or delight in your life is somehow a bad thing for a Buddhist. And it means that you have failed in your mindfulness and overall dedication. The claim is to have doubt that you are a good Buddhist and to have shame about your spiritual calling when you have a feeling of great happiness that you enjoy. May I say that one of the key tenets and directives of Buddhism is to have a spiritual awakening and enter the highest form of happiness, namely nirvana. Therefore, this claim is completely out of bounds. The Zen Buddhists practice the middle path or the middle way in their spirituality. We are neither ascetics, nor are we corrupt, sex and drug crazed progressives living in debauchery. The Buddhist student has total freedom and encouragement to smile with others, occasionally laugh, and of course be happy, all of which are elements of the Eightfold Path taught by the Buddha and relate directly to the paths of right view, right speech, and right action. An additional frightening or scary teaching the Buddhists supposedly have, as noted by critics, remember there are several variations of Buddhism, is that we teach non-existence, that we don't exist at all. This is incorrect. They might falsely add that if Buddhists believe they do not exist at all, then it gives them freedom to physically and mentally harm others without reprisal. Have you ever heard of a half-baked lie? This is one that might be pinned on the head of an innocent Buddhist by any given skeptic. Remember, the Eightfold Wheel or path to nirvana. If a Buddhist student engaged in this activity, they would be breaking the Buddha's paths to enlightenment in several ways. For example, right view, right action, right speech, and of course, right intention. The key point is that the Buddha never said we do not exist at all. He said we are to discard the personal self. These are two very different concepts. The Buddha taught that it is not true to say to yourself or others that you are nothing or non-existent, because that would be misleading. Therefore, we can easily see that someone criticizing Buddhism in this particular instance, has tragically taken things out of context, particularly as it relates to semantics or word meanings. So, the Buddha himself implied we as humans are hovering somewhere in the middle of total non-existence and a total complete self. If a Buddhist master teacher says you are nothing, it doesn't mean he thinks you are invisible, insignificant, or have dissolved into the cosmos. Rather, by saying you are nothing, the idea is to remove and forever discard your personal ego, which is filled with cravings and thirsts. Said in a slightly different way, again, many people mistake the Buddha's meaning of his lesson regarding no self or the non-self entity. They believe he was trying to convey that the personal self does not exist at all. The Buddha never said that. In fact, he claimed that to say, I do not exist, is just as misleading as saying, I am. The best way to explain this is that although the Buddha fully understood both facets, in that one, humans exist, but at the same time, everyone must, two, discard the self and adopt the Buddhist teaching of anatta, or no self. The point here is that it's okay to realize you energetically exist, but when we form rigid identities and labels, then we begin wanting and desiring, which of course are causes of suffering, as taught by the Buddha Siddhartha's first noble truth. When we form these rigid identities and labels, in essence, that personal self begins wanting, desiring to complete the self, and of course, the results are suffering, or the first noble truth, namely dukkha. Now, regarding the Buddha's teaching on impermanence, this too can be taken out of context and made to seem that he was misleading his followers about the afterlife and the uncertain temporary nature of reality. Please allow me to explain. It is very disheartening to many folks to believe that their love relationships, jobs, or even health is impermanent and can quickly change. Discouraging or not, this continuous change is the standard protocol of existence on Earth. Think of the life and death cycle of plant life or even sea creatures. Therefore, you may want to tread lightly as a suggestion and contemplate very deeply as you foolishly invest money, time, and energy into multiple aspects of life, incorrectly believing they are fixed and certain. Nothing is a sure thing, such as our relationships, jobs, income, and housing, as you may have experienced in the past. The point is, expecting temporary circumstances to remain permanent goes against the Buddhist teaching of impermanence, and expecting those temporary circumstances to remain fixed or permanent will intensify the pain and suffering of loss, grief, and disappointment when change does indeed happen. This too can be scary. Just a simple, cursory overview of reality and life on Earth clearly points to the fact that things are constantly changing, even things that appear solid and permanent to our eyes. For example, your house may look solid, but without continuous maintenance and care, it will deteriorate, crumble, and eventually return to the dirt and dust. If you know anything about quantum physics or the universal truth of quantum entanglement, you'll also understand that at the atomic and molecular levels, there is a high speed vibration and movement going on. Nothing at the root of human existence, as evidenced by quantum observations, is permanent or fixed. It is in constant dynamic movement. So to reiterate, with a slight variation, we can say that when a non-Buddhist recognizes the sharp and clear nature of impermanence, it may trigger stress and anxiety about life's uncertainty and unpredictability. According to true Zen Buddhism, however, accepting impermanence is very comforting and liberating. You might be thinking, what is so liberating, or what is the great consolation of knowing that you have impermanent or temporary family relationships, well-paying career, or a healthy body? Let's look at the example of the realities of physical pain or mental anguish. The ancient saying of "this too shall pass" is very apropos here. There is a great benefit in realizing that impermanence is a friend in that instance. Okay, so is one of the scariest teachings of Buddhism impermanence? I think not. Okay, as we can see, for practicing Zen Buddhists, the reality of the phenomenal world that we experience with our five senses is a reality that constantly changes, is dynamic and impermanent. The Buddha taught the threads of reality are transitory and in a constant flux because of specific causes and conditions. For example, nature's four-season cycle, the human life cycle, growth and death of botanical life, and even the rise and fall of royal families. To not understand or to be ignorant of these realities, the Buddha taught, would be to make a big mistake that led to even more suffering in life. That's because when you are ignorant of or deliberately disbelieve the reality of impermanence, you end up with dukkha, or suffering from your incessant desiring, craving, and wanting. You end up in the cycle of repeating the same foolish mistakes from the past. Therefore, nirvana is never achieved. Let's briefly touch on a scary teaching of Buddhism that indirectly relates to a somewhat chilling concept within Christianity. As in Buddhism, there are many more branches and variations within the faith of Christianity, such as Mormons versus Jehovah's Witnesses versus born-again believers, etc. But in 2 or 3 variations, it is taught that when you present yourself and ask for prayer from church elders, as in the case of a physical illness or financial crisis, you must have incredible faith, and that if you do not get healed by God or get your financial crisis fixed by God, it is because your faith was weak. Similarly, some critics say that within Buddhism, one of the tantamount directives is to have powerful and unwavering mindfulness and meditation, which is a partial truth. Your hours spent in mindful thinking and quiet meditation must produce great spiritual results on the path to nirvana, they might say. If not, the critics may say it's because you are mentally weak and lazy, which will keep you from ever discovering enlightenment. I'd like to conclude by saying, in both instances I explained, the Christian version and the Buddhist version, whomever is propagating these foolish notions, they are the ones teaching a scary doctrine, not the other way around. Students, as in any aspect of existence, even our Zen beliefs, we must follow the Buddhist rule of impermanence. This means there is no fixed guarantee you will get your healing or your perfect time spent in mindfulness and meditation. Some days you will get great physical or mental breakthroughs, and sometimes your meditation will deliver an amazing and satisfying result, but other times the opposite may hold true. The Buddhist doctrine of impermanence is a scientific and universal law, however, and it cannot be reversed. This does not mean you cannot appreciate or even love an impermanent element of your life, such as a spouse or child. Critics would say that Buddhists are not allowed to have this type of love for family or fellow man. Again, all hogwash, which is usually disseminated by folks that have had bad experiences with church leaders or congregational believers. They have a chip on their shoulder that is filled with resentment, and therefore they project that to the world through being critical of other faiths or beliefs. Remember, the Buddha's original teaching of the middle way, or the middle path between total deprivation and total liberality, right? This means we can dip our feet slightly into both worlds without interrupting our peace and our spirituality. For example, we can temporarily attach ourselves to a loved one, even fill them with periods of affection, such as between a husband and wife. But at the same time, we must understand this indeed is temporary, and although we might enjoy that person for many seasons or years, eventually the rule of impermanence must hold true. Now here's where it gets interesting and intriguing. We're going to enter a somewhat frightening discussion about karma and rebirth. Let's say frightening for some folks, but comforting for others. Allow me to explain. If the Buddha taught the no-self doctrine and separating it from karma and rebirth, if he taught those were separate entities, everything would be a bit more clear. But the confusion in the minds of many is that he not only taught you have a personal identity, he not only taught you have no personal identity or personal I am, but at the same time, he instructed us about a personal karma and rebirth. Now, if there is no self, who or what becomes reborn? Likewise, if there is not an I am, then how can you or anyone generate either good or bad karma? The critical questions continue. Does the creation of karma and how it points to the next life experience, does this suggest our current and future lives are predetermined? Also, why does the Buddha teach us to put effort into improving our lives and the lives of others if everything is predetermined by the universe? So it's easy to see that our personal karma and rebirth could be a problematic topic to deeply consider. Okay, we don't necessarily want to deeply consider this, okay, because it is problematic, is what I'm saying. In fact, the Buddha said not to put such effort into trying to understand rebirth, and that these are subjects that are unpredictable, and to make guesses or conjecture about them would bring madness and displeasure. The basic Sanskrit word karma literally means acting or accomplishing or even doing. By karma, the Buddha meant an intentional action, not the results of an action, nor a blessing, nor a curse, okay? An action, something you do. To put this in a somewhat correct English sentence, one could say that we are constantly creating karmas in our life. And it's our free will if those karmas, it's up to our free will if those karmas are positive or negative. For example, if a corrupt person goes to rob the bank, he completes the action of dark or bad karma for himself because that action was motivated by greed. A key point is that our motivations and intentions belong solely to us, and the result of those intentions are what defines our karmas. The Buddha also said that through intention, one does karma by way of the physical body, mental thought, or spoken word. The first element of karma is not only about what we do, but also what we say and what we think also. The second element of karma, which is the good or bad results, is what folks usually mistaken as the law of karma. Speaking of the law of karma, who is it that enforces this law? One might ask, if there is no God. Is there a divine overseer of karmic implications? This is just like the point I made about entry into nirvana. Who makes these decisions if Buddhists teach that there is no formal deity or God? The answer, of course, is that these are natural laws of the universe that are immutable. This means, in the grand scheme of things, the universal laws of cause and effect are who and what enforce karma as it relates to good or evil. The confusion for many is they cannot wrap their heads around the fact that the universe does not necessarily need to be the same as God, but the universe indeed is supreme intelligence and therefore delivers appropriate blessings or a cursing to us based on our actions or karmas. Some may say that it's not the universe delivering justice, but rather the laws of nature. However you want to slice this or call this, the meaning is virtually the same. In summation, the result is that you receive in this life, and maybe even the next, what you give in this life. And that is simply the truth of universal reality. So to drive this point deeply into your consciousness, allow me to repeat that the Buddha taught the law of karma is a fundamental principle of reality, like gravity or magnetism. As an analogy, we can study and understand the properties of magnetism or magnetics, and we can use them for our benefit, or we can suffer because we are ignorant of them. The same goes for karma and rebirth. It is recorded that the Buddha mystically and prophetically observed the rebirths of many beings according to karma. This happened at the moment of his awakening. He saw existence as the routine of both the birth and reincarnation of beings in endless cycles. This cyclical algorithm he saw is not random, but works according to causes and conditions. Most importantly, each new generation of a being is determined by the intentional actions of its past existence. In short, one's rebirth is determined by past karma. The Buddha called this cosmic algorithm samsara, which means the wandering. And this could be considered one of Buddhism's scariest teachings. In his visions, the Buddha saw existence ranked by over 30 separate dimensions or dimensionality, which he called the planes of existence or the levels of existence. Some of these are material, like humans or animals, while others are spiritual or immaterial, like the dimension of hungry ghosts, for example. So this is where things could get frightening for some. But in my opinion, they don't compare to the angelic and demonic activity described in the biblical book of Revelation. Anyway, a key point taught by the Buddha, however, is that at the point of death, our accumulated karma forms a new being in one of the many planes of samsara, or the wandering. Bright or good karma creates a rebirth in a higher plane, and dark karma in a lower one. The Buddha said these are universal laws, not mysterious ideas or concepts to ponder. He claimed karmic rebirth is an empirical law you can observe for yourself. Of course, to observe it, you must first cultivate your mind to be extremely intuitive And that only occurs after countless hours of mindfulness, meditation, and the deliberate removal of want and desire. In essence, that occurs when you are enlightened. Interestingly, this is so difficult that few have ever managed to do this. If you want to attempt such a grand task and arrive at the ultimate destination of mind and spirit, I created an entire video to help you with this effort. It's entitled 8 Roads to Buddhist Enlightenment. The Buddha's teaching about karma and rebirth was presented to his students as a universal fact that should not be debated or refuted. It was accepted with enthusiasm as a guide, and it taught that existence rolls on in endless cycles, and whether it is filled with suffering or happiness is purely dependent on your intentional actions. As another example, the Buddha told his students to scrutinize their every deliberate action as follows. Is my action leading to self-affliction or maybe to the affliction of others? Being that self-affliction or affliction toward others, either verbal or physical, is the genesis for suffering, then it is considered to be a form of black, bad, or dark karma. That's because ultimately there is no distinction between self and others. Always remember the law of entanglement, okay? You can look that up, and how you are interconnected to all sentient beings within the universe via this law. The second rule involves scrutiny. The Buddha said, always ask yourself if your intentional action is rooted in craving, yearning, or purposeful ignorance, as in the case of avoiding what you know is right. If so, then that too is black or dark karma. Now, if your actions and thoughts neither afflict yourself or others, if they are not rooted in want or desire, then you have not generated the kind of karma that will lead to negative results for you. Instead, you have created brilliant karma or bright karma. Please allow me to provide you with a short and non-exhaustive list of deliberate actions or sins of omission that will end up hurting you when it comes to the universal law of karma. When you lie or are deceitful to others, when you rob or steal from others, when you are sexually perverted and use your body in ways of debauchery, when you insult, scream at, hate, or are sarcastic to your fellow man. And let me say, this is a short list because the Buddha actually taught that there were 10 categories of actions that created dark or bad karma. The good news is that there is an equal list of actions that create good, positive, bright, or brilliant karma, and they are simply the reverse of what I just mentioned. For example, always tell the truth. Be gentle and kind, and use your bodies in ways, such as in the example of sexuality, using it in ways that are appropriate and non-scandalous. An interesting point taught by the Buddha over 2,500 years ago is that every kind of dark karma can be traced back to something he called the 3 fires, namely hatred, craving, and thirsting. And lastly, deliberate ignorance of what the student knows is right action. You may be thinking, why is being ignorant a root element for the creation of dark karma? To understand this better, we may want to translate this word from Sanskrit to be clearer. In the original form, it is translated as being in the dark. And when it is combined with deliberate action, then that's where and when trouble occurs. As an example, you see someone choking to death on a meal. Instead of helping, you deliberately walk away and ignore your fellow man in need. Similarly, you are speaking with someone on the phone and they have the impression you are hard at work in your business. You don't correct them and say you're at home, and you even end the call by saying you are super busy and working hard. Sadly, you're actually at home cooking a big meal and you needed to get off the phone. This would be considered deliberately deceitful and allowing the other person to be ignorant of your true whereabouts or activity. Now, let's take another look at the potentially frightening subject of rebirth and reincarnation. Remember that rebirth is a word used in Buddhism most of the time instead of reincarnation. But neither word truly describes what takes place. The word suggests that you pass away, then become reborn as the same person. Obviously, this goes against the Buddhist doctrine of non-self. So it's not entirely an accurate word for what takes place. Said in another way, the concept of a personal self or an I am is taught against by the Buddha because the personal self is always wanting and desiring something and therefore experiences dukkha. So when we talk about rebirth, a self, a personal I am, does not pass from one life to the next. And according to the Buddha, to believe that is to believe a great delusion. The doctrine of non-self, or in the original language, anatta, teaches that you exist as a combination of 5 aggregates or universal components. You can call those ingredients if you want. When you pass from this life into another, your energy, let's say, is attached to these 5 elements, and it simply dissolves in this life and reforms in the next. But you are a different being. Therefore, we can say when the reincarnation takes place, you are still a non-self because nothing carried over from your previous life except for the karma you created, okay? And you became a new version of a new you. Upon entering that new you, every aspect of your being is extinguished in the past life and based on the good or bad karma you generated. The fire of new life is lit again, and as a new being, you must relearn life along with all the negative or positive actions that determine how your life is either enjoyed or regretted. As a matter of objective fact, no personal self ever gets born in the first place. Rather, karma-infused cosmic energy replicates by way of the universe and through quantum physics, thereby forming an energetic being that has a mind to begin making decisions and follow those decisions up with deliberate actions, whether good or bad, whether life-giving or life-destroying. So this indeed can be one of Buddhism's scariest teachings, because if you have a bad heart with bad intentions and an ongoing creation of dark or bad karma, then when your atoms and molecules reform in the next life, this may turn out mighty bad for you. You may even reincarnate to be the devil's child, slated by the universe for destruction of both mind and body in a worst case scenario. Incidentally, if you've not watched my video on no self, I just want to explain that the Buddha describes the world of self and of reality as a combination of those 5 aggregates or components I just described. Therefore, it may be important as you move forward in Zen Buddhism, if that should be your decision, for you to understand that you are nothing more than the following 5 ingredients of life. 1, form or body. 2, feelings or emotions. 3, cognition or intelligence. 4, mental ideas or concepts. And lastly, 5, pure consciousness. At a rudimentary level, you could rename these 5 elements as 1, physical or visual form, for example, shapes and colors. 2, feelings, for example, sadness or happiness. 3, intellect, for example, cognitive thoughts, plans, or memories. 4, mental structure or formations, for example, desires, likes, or passions, which, as we know, are very bad. And lastly, 5, perceptions, which include all of what you are consciously aware of. So when we tie this fundamental truth of Buddhism into both karma and rebirth, we can see why the Buddha also emphasized the teaching of detachment, or removing oneself from desires, wants, ambitions, or goals. It is because by foolishly attaching yourself to all the greed, pleasures, and temptations of life, you attempt to replace the natural laws of timing that the universe has laid out. You end up forcing the issue on many things that will simply pass through time according to how they are supposed to be. In essence, you force the issue and make bad decisions that lead to dark karma and potentially a tragic rebirth. The Buddha taught that the self is a common label for the patterns or configurations within those 5 aggregates. The self always attempts to manipulate and stimulate the 5 aggregates beyond their normal alignment, and thus generates either light, bright, or dark, bad karma and all its implications. The delusion of I am, expressed as desire, such as I want this or I wish for that, forces us into intentional actions. These premeditated actions gather configurations of the 5 aggregates. These configurations eventually transform into whether we end up with a blessed karma or a bad karmic result. Regardless of that result, we find ourselves within either a self-made dungeon or a self-made majestic mansion, because it all relates to samsara, or the endless wandering represented by a new life or a rebirth. You may be asking, is there any escape from this closed loop of wandering or rebirth? According to the Buddha, it is a fact of life and there is no escape. However, there are the third and fourth noble truths. They teach us that amazingly good karma can be experienced, so much so that we can potentially reach enlightenment and nirvana. It all comes down to our own free will and decisions in life, particularly the willful decision to remove all desire, want, and craving from your existence. The Buddha tells us karma and rebirth can be confirmed. Okay, it can be confirmed in visions and by direct experience upon becoming enlightened. Remember the wheel and the eightfold path to nirvana again. To become enlightened in a Zen Buddhist sense, one must continually practice the Buddhist eight-road pathway with total devotion. Again, although it's possible, the fact is that because of disbelief and laziness, very few people have the endurance to stay focused on this beautiful endeavor. As I mentioned in one of my last videos on this subject, I advise the Zen Buddhist student spend a minimum of 6 daily hours in mindfulness and meditation. Sadly, other than myself and one other person that I know, I've never found anyone else willing to endure this type of dedication toward achieving nirvana. When you are willing to bear the burden, however, my friend, the elusive and somewhat unattainable nirvana can indeed become a reality for you, just as it did for the original Buddha. If you can miraculously achieve this state of being, then obviously it's an end of ignorance and bad karma and the beginning of enlightenment and good karma. You will realize the end of desiring or wanting, and also an end of caring about personal identities you have placed on yourself. You simply are mindful and content in a current state of Zen peace because you understand the doctrine of no self and the results of becoming awakened. When you live by this ancient Zen Buddhist philosophy, you will undoubtedly realize bright and good karma, and a radiant grace will start to surround you. By that I mean an aura of positive energy will appear around you, creating a luminous being who has become a temple of absolute contentment and happiness. In essence, you have become someone that figured out the path to nirvana, someone that became like the wise, ancient Buddha, the awakened one, and the great enlightened one.